The small village of Darmanesti, nestled deep in the Carpathian Mountains of Romania, is a place where time seems to stand still. A town steeped in silence, wrapped in an eerie stillness that gives the impression of a forgotten world, untouched by the hustle of modern life. Yet, this is no ordinary village. Darmanesti hides a chilling secret at its very core, a secret that has remained shrouded in mystery for centuries. At the heart of the village lies an unmarked grave, a burial site that has intrigued and terrified locals for generations. No stone marks the grave, no name is carved into its surface, and yet the people who live here, or those who once did, are deeply aware of its presence. It is a presence that haunts the very soil of Darmanesti, one that has become as much a part of the village as its ancient trees and crumbling houses. This grave, this inexplicable and disturbing place, is more than just a resting spot for the dead. It is the centerpiece of a haunting mystery that still lingers to this day. The village itself, with its narrow cobbled streets and abandoned houses, exudes an unsettling quiet. It's as though the world outside has forgotten about it, leaving only the echoes of its tragic past to reverberate through its empty streets. The grave, standing alone in the center, appears almost like a forgotten monument, a silent sentinel guarding secrets that no one dares to fully uncover. Those who live in its shadow speak of it in hushed tones, their words filled with a sense of fear and reverence. For some, the grave represents the end of an era, a time when the village was alive and thriving, before it became a place where death and silence ruled. For others, it is a symbol of something far darker, an omen, a warning, or perhaps a curse that has hung over Darmanesti for generations. Why, in a world that has so often moved forward, does this grave remain so important? Why has a village, whose name few even remember, chosen to build itself around something so obscure, so dark? To answer that question, one must delve into the very history of Darmanesti, into the time when it was founded, the events that shaped it, and the mystery that continues to overshadow its every stone. In the year 1748, a time when Romania was still under the grip of the Ottoman Empire, the village of Darmanesti was established. The political landscape of the region was shifting, with the Habsburgs exerting more influence over the area. Life in the Carpathian Mountains was difficult: harsh winters, rugged terrain, and a constant struggle to survive. Yet, the people who lived here were resilient. They forged their homes and their lives from the land, creating a small, isolated community that would come to be known for one thing above all else: the grave that no one dared to question. In the early years, Darmanesti was a village like any other. The people were simple, working as farmers, shepherds, and laborious, their lives revolving around the rhythms of nature. But over time, strange things began to happen. Whispers started to spread throughout the village about the grave, and those whispers only grew louder as the years passed. Who was buried there? Why was the grave so carefully hidden from the rest of the world? What was the secret it held? Some said the grave belonged to a powerful figure, someone whose death had been so significant that it needed to be concealed. Others believed it held the remains of a criminal, someone whose death had been too horrific to commemorate publicly. Yet another theory suggested that the grave belonged to a victim of some ancient plague, a disease that had ravaged the region in the years before the village's founding. But the most chilling theory was that the grave held the remains of someone who had been executed for a crime too dark to speak of. A person whose death had been so unnatural, so twisted, that the village chose to hide it away, as though by doing so, they could erase the darkness that had come with it. Despite the numerous theories, no one knew for sure who was buried in the grave. The town's elders, who should have known the truth, were either too afraid or too stubborn to speak about it. As the years passed, the mystery deepened. Those who had once lived in Darmanesti either moved away or died, leaving behind only a handful of people to carry on the secrets of the past. And yet, the grave remained, as if waiting for someone to uncover the truth. There are those who claim that the grave is cursed, that the village's fate is tied to it, and that the silence that hangs over Darmanesti is the result of something far more sinister than just a forgotten past. Over the years, several people who have dared to investigate the grave have reported strange occurrences. There have been sightings of shadowy figures moving between the trees at night, the sound of whispers carried on the wind, and inexplicable feelings of dread that seem to seep into the very air. Some locals believe that the grave holds the restless spirit of its occupant, a spirit that will never find peace until its identity is revealed. Others insist that the grave is a warning, a mark of some ancient evil that was never meant to be disturbed. The eerie silence of Darmanesti only adds to the sense of mystery. It is a village that seems frozen in time, as though the events that once shaped it have been locked away in the past, never to be fully understood. And yet, the grave remains, standing as a silent reminder of all that has been lost, and all that may still be hidden beneath the soil. In this documentary, we will explore the mystery of Dalmanesti and its unmarked grave. We will delve into the dark history of the village, searching for clues that might explain why such a place exists, and why it continues to captivate the imagination of those who encounter it. What happened in the year 1748 that led to the founding of this village? Who lies beneath the earth, and why is their grave so carefully concealed? And most importantly, why does this haunting site continue to hold such power over the living? As we unravel the secrets of this forgotten settlement, we will uncover a story that stretches far beyond the boundaries of time. A story of death, mystery, and the things that are never meant to be forgotten. A story that may finally shed light on the chilling truth behind the silent town of Dalmanesti. In the year 1748, Romania stood at the crossroads of history, caught between empires, shifting political powers, and centuries of cultural turmoil. The region was still recovering from the lingering shadows of Ottoman influence, while the Habsburgs had begun to assert their dominance over Transylvania, an area long known for its strategic importance. These were years of great instability, not only in Romania but across much of Europe. Wars raged, empires clashed, and ancient traditions faced the harsh winds of modernization. Yet amid these great changes, there existed pockets of people, isolated and tucked away in the most remote corners of the land, living lives defined by simplicity, hardship, and ancient customs. Transylvania, particularly, was a land of mystery and folklore, an ancient region filled with dense forests, snow-capped mountains, and eerie, mist-covered valleys. It was a land where the supernatural held sway over the everyday lives of its people. In many villages, people clung to old customs, relying on remedies passed down through generations and beliefs shaped by centuries of myth and legend. It is in this fertile ground of superstition and tradition that the village of Dalmanesti was born. The founding of Dalmanesti was not unlike that of countless other villages scattered across the Romanian countryside. It began with a handful of settlers seeking to carve out a life in a land that was both harsh and beautiful. They sought refuge in the remote expanse of the Carpathian Mountains, far from the shifting politics of the larger cities. This was a place where survival was dictated by the seasons, where people relied on agriculture, animal husbandry, and the strength of their community. In such a place, the importance of family, religion, and the land could not be overstated. But Dalmanesti, like so many other small settlements of the time, was also a place where darkness could take root. It was not long before rumors began to circulate about the village's unusual beginnings. While most villages grew naturally out of a need for trade, agriculture, and defense, Dalmanesti seemed to have appeared as if out of nowhere, its origins veiled in secrecy. The village was built around a strange and unsettling grave, one that had no marker, no name, no indication of who had been buried there. This was an anomaly that could not be ignored, especially in a land where death was often commemorated with great ceremony. The local population of Dalmanesti, mostly farmers, craftsmen, and traders, were not strangers to death. In a world where disease, war, and natural disasters were constant threats, death came as a regular visitor. But death was also viewed differently in rural Romania. It was not merely the end of a life, it was the beginning of a journey. The belief in the afterlife was deeply rooted in the people's Orthodox Christian faith, mixed with local folklore that spoke of spirits, demons, and the restless dead. A grave, especially one placed at the center of a community, was a serious matter. It was not something that could be left unmarked, unacknowledged, or unexplained. And yet, this was precisely what had happened in Dalmanesti. The grave, situated at the very heart of the village, was a silent reminder of something, or someone, that had been forgotten by history. It was a source of both fear and reverence for the villagers, who spoke of it only in whispers. No one dared to ask too many questions. The presence of the grave was something that could not be questioned, for to do so was to invite misfortune, or so the elders claimed. It was as though the very act of acknowledging the grave's mystery might somehow disturb the peace that had been built around it, as if the grave held within it not only the remains of the dead but the very secrets of the village itself. At the time, the religious and cultural practices of the era played a significant role in the village's relationship with death. In the rural villages of Transylvania, it was common to bury the dead near the center of a settlement, but it was equally common to mark graves with stones, crosses, or some form of memorial. This was done not only to honor the deceased but also to provide a spiritual safeguard for the community. The presence of a grave, unmarked and unspoken of, defied these traditions in a way that could not be ignored. It was as if the dead in Dharmanesti had refused the comfort of recognition, perhaps because their death had been so shrouded in mystery, so out of place, that the community was unwilling or unable to confront it. The village of Dharmanesti existed under the shadow of this unmarked grave. And yet, the people continued their daily lives, as they had for centuries, unaware, or unwilling to acknowledge, the force that the grave exerted over their village. While the rest of the world advanced, the settlement seemed to remain frozen in time. The villagers worked their land, tending to their animals, cultivating crops, and participating in the rituals of their orthodox faith, but they never strayed too far from their superstitions. It was a delicate balance of belief and fear, one that governed the villagers' every move. One of the most significant aspects of this period in history was the ongoing tension between the old ways of the peasantry and the rising influence of foreign rule. The Habsburgs, who had begun their dominance over Transylvania in the early 18th century, brought with them new laws, taxes, and regulations that further alienated the villagers. Life under Habsburg rule was harsh, and the people of Dharmanesti were no exception. With their deep-rooted traditions, the villagers found it difficult to reconcile their way of life with the demands of the ruling power. This tension undoubtedly contributed to the villagers' sense of isolation, both geographically and culturally. It was during this time of unrest that the legend of the unmarked grave began to take shape. As the village continued to grow, so did the myths surrounding the grave. Some believed that the grave belonged to a powerful figure, perhaps a nobleman who had met an untimely death under mysterious circumstances. Others whispered that it might be the final resting place of a plague victim, someone whose death had come so suddenly and violently that their grave could not be marked for fear of spreading the illness. And still, others believed that the grave was linked to the darker side of Transylvanian history, the old pagan beliefs, the cults, and the practices that had been driven underground by the spread of Christianity. These superstitions and fears clung to the grave, and over time, they became inseparable from the identity of the village itself. The village's deepening ties to superstition and fear surrounding the grave were compounded by the political upheaval of the time. The Habsburgs, for all their power, could not erase the old ways. They could not suppress the fears that had festered in the hearts of the people for generations. Instead, they found themselves confronted with a culture that had resisted their influence, a people who remained connected to something older, something far more primal than the rule of any empire. The grave at the center of Dharmanesti was a symbol of that resistance, a reminder that, no matter how hard the world tried to move forward, some things would remain untouchable, unexplainable, and forever hidden in the shadows of history. As time passed, the mystery of the unmarked grave grew more profound. It became not just a place of burial but a site of deep significance for the villagers. The silence around the grave, combined with the rising tensions of the era, would shape the destiny of Dharmanesti in ways that no one could have foreseen. And in that silence, the secrets of the grave would continue to haunt the village for centuries to come. The village of Dharmanesti is a place where the past never quite fades away. It stands as a testament to forgotten times, its existence perpetuated by its proximity to a mystery that has lingered in the shadows for centuries. Built around the central, unmarked grave, the village itself is as much a part of the enigma as the grave is. Its streets, once bustling with the laughter and hard work of its inhabitants, now lie eerily quiet. The houses, though weathered and decaying, are still standing, their walls thick with the memories of a time when life here seemed normal, unremarkable even. But even these quiet structures seem to carry the weight of something unspoken, something deeply unsettling that has haunted this village for generations. The grave, situated in the very heart of the village, dominates the town's landscape in ways that cannot be ignored. It's not merely the physical presence of the grave, but the aura of mystery that surrounds it. The villagers, who continue to live in its shadow, are well aware of its significance, though none speak of it openly. It is a subject approached with reverence and fear, a topic that often becomes the subject of hushed conversations behind closed doors. And while the grave itself is central to the village's identity, it is the stories, myths, and legends that have grown around it that truly define the town's legacy. In the early years of Dharmanesti, when the village was first founded, life was shaped by the rhythms of nature, the seasons, and the very land itself. It was a place where families worked together to survive, relying on their close-knit community and the fertile ground that surrounded them. In this remote part of Romania, isolated from the political and cultural upheavals of the outside world, the villagers could preserve their old ways, holding on to their traditions, beliefs, and superstitions. The presence of the grave, however, was never fully understood, and as time passed, it began to take on a more ominous tone, its importance growing with each passing year. The grave became the village's silent keeper, a place that bound the people to the past in ways they could neither fully explain nor escape. Some believed it marked the resting place of a powerful figure, someone whose death had been so significant that it required secrecy. Perhaps it was the grave of a lord or nobleman who had perished under mysterious or violent circumstances, and the village, out of reverence or fear, had chosen to keep it hidden. Others whispered that the grave was that of a victim of some long-forgotten plague, one so deadly and sudden that the very act of marking the grave would invite the return of the disease. For some, the grave represented a curse, a malevolent force that had taken root in the land and which could only be kept at bay by silence and ignorance. As the years stretched on, the mystery of the grave deepened. New generations of villagers were born and raised with the knowledge of its existence, but few ever dared to question it. The older members of the community spoke of the grave as though it were an integral part of their lives, a fact of their existence that had always been there and would always remain. For the younger ones, it was simply a part of the landscape, something that had always been a fixture of the village, unremarkable in its familiarity but unsettling in its quietude. The grave was not to be disturbed, for doing so would be an invitation to tragedy, so the people of Darmanesti lived around it, but never with it. But the village, like the rest of the world, could not remain frozen in time. Despite its isolation, Darmanesti was not immune to the broader forces of history. The Habsburgs, who had sought to impose order on the region, had begun to expand their control over the Carpathian region, bringing with them new laws, new systems of governance, and new ways of thinking. In the face of this outside influence, the people of Darmanesti held fast to their old ways, clinging to their traditions and beliefs, refusing to relinquish the customs that had defined their lives for centuries. The grave, in this context, became a symbol of the village's defiance, a rejection of the encroaching world and an assertion of the town's deep connection to the land and its history. Yet the arrival of outsiders, and the changes they brought, stirred unrest in the village. The unmarked grave, which had once been a source of mystery and reverence, now began to feel like an anchor, a link to a past that seemed increasingly out of place in the modern world. Despite the villagers' best efforts to maintain their old ways, the pressures of change began to take their toll. The grave, once a symbol of their continuity, now seemed to be a reminder of the tensions that lay beneath the surface of the community. It became increasingly difficult for the villagers to reconcile the old with the new, to balance their deep-rooted traditions with the realities of a changing world. In the face of this change, the village began to lose its vitality. Younger generations, who had been born into the traditions of their ancestors, began to drift away, seeking better opportunities in the larger cities and towns. The once thriving community became a place of slow decay, as people moved away and left behind only the memory of a village that had once been alive with activity. The streets, once filled with the sounds of laughter, work, and conversation, grew quiet. The houses that had once been homes to large families were now left empty, abandoned, and forgotten. And still, the grave stood at the center, as though mocking the passage of time. The desolation that befell Darmanesti only added to the sense of foreboding that surrounded the village. The town became a place where few dared to visit, a location that existed more in the realm of legend than reality. Rumors spread about the strange happenings in the village, disembodied voices at night, shadowy figures seen moving in the mist, a palpable sense of unease that seemed to linger in the very air. Those who had once lived in Darmanesti refused to speak of it, unable to shake the feeling that something dark and unknowable lay at the heart of the village. The grave, with its unspoken history, continued to hold the power to unsettle those who dared to acknowledge it. The few who still lived in Darmanesti could not escape the pull of the grave. For them, it was an ever-present reminder of the past, a past that could never be fully understood or laid to rest. The villagers, though scattered and reduced in number, still felt the weight of the mystery that had defined their lives. It was a legacy that they could neither embrace nor escape, one that bound them to the village and its secrets. And as the years went by, the unmarked grave became not just a place of death, but a symbol of the village itself, lost, forgotten, and forever haunted by the shadows of its past. The unmarked grave at the heart of Darmanesti has long been a source of intrigue, speculation, and fear. Over the centuries, countless theories have emerged about who or what lies beneath the soil, each one more haunting than the last. To the villagers, the mystery of the grave is a part of their identity, as ingrained in their lives as the very land they live on. Yet, despite the endless speculation, no one truly knows the truth. The absence of a marker, the lack of any definitive record, only deepens the enigma surrounding it. As time passed, the theories about the grave evolved, each new generation contributing their own ideas about the identity of the person, or perhaps entity, buried there. In a village defined by silence, the grave's mystery has only grown louder. One of the most persistent theories about the unmarked grave is that it holds the remains of a powerful figure. Perhaps a lord, nobleman, or someone of great influence in the region, whose death was so significant that the villagers felt it necessary to conceal their identity. The notion of a hidden noble resting place has long been an appealing one for the people of Dharmanesti. After all, the region was no stranger to the influence of the aristocracy and military leaders who once ruled over Transylvania. It's easy to imagine a high-ranking officer, a military commander, or perhaps a wealthy merchant who met a mysterious and untimely death in the area. Such a figure might have been buried in secret, perhaps due to their controversial actions or the threat they posed to the political stability of the time. This theory would certainly explain the peculiar placement of the grave at the village's center. A noble figure, after all, would demand a special kind of tribute, even in death. The secrecy surrounding the grave could be seen as an attempt to protect the memory of the deceased, to avoid attracting the attention of rival factions or political enemies. Perhaps the person buried there had been a victim of assassination, their death so violent and politically charged that even the people of Dharmanesti felt compelled to keep it hidden. There could have been whispers of rebellion, betrayal, or scandal tied to this person's life and death, and the villagers, in their attempts to safeguard the reputation of their community, opted to bury the individual in an unmarked grave. However, as time wore on, this theory began to clash with other ideas that emerged from the folklore and history of the region. The mystery surrounding the grave could not easily be dismissed as the burial site of a single noble figure, no matter how influential. For in Transylvania, and particularly in the Carpathian Mountains, the legends of the supernatural are far more common than the stories of the mortal elite. It is in these mountains, after all, that many of Europe's most enduring tales of witches, vampires, and other supernatural creatures have their roots. Could the grave be the final resting place of someone involved in dark rituals, witchcraft, or even vampire lore? The folklore of Transylvania is deeply entwined with the belief in the supernatural, with creatures of darkness and mythic beings said to inhabit the mountains and forests surrounding Dharmanesti. Tales of witch trials, blood-sucking demons, and shape-shifting spirits abound in the region. In a place so rich in superstition and fear, it is not hard to imagine that the grave might belong to someone associated with these ancient, forbidden practices. According to some theories, the unmarked grave could be the final resting place of a witch or warlock, someone whose death was so feared that their burial was kept secret. Perhaps the villagers, who would have lived in constant fear of retribution from the powers that be, buried the individual without ceremony, lest the supernatural forces they had meddled with return for vengeance. This theory finds strength in the long-standing traditions of the region, where the line between the natural and the supernatural is often blurred. The villagers, who likely carried with them the weight of centuries-old beliefs, might have buried someone whose death was not only tragic but also inexplicably strange, an unnatural death that defied explanation. What if the person buried in that unmarked grave had been associated with witchcraft or occult practices? What if their powers were so feared that the community chose to erase their identity, hoping to rid themselves of the curse they believed had been cast upon them? Some even believed that the grave could belong to a victim of the notorious vampire legends of the region. Transylvania, after all, is the birthplace of Count Dracula, and many of the superstitions surrounding the undead stem from this deeply ingrained cultural history. The theory that the grave could hold the remains of a vampire, or someone believed to have been a vampire, has gained traction among those who view Dharmanesti as a place caught between the boundaries of folklore and reality. The grave could have been the final resting place of a vampire hunter, an accused vampire, or someone who had become a victim of an ancient curse. Perhaps the villagers had no choice but to bury the deceased in secret, fearful that their legend would live on in a way that could bring disaster to the community. The idea that the grave was the final resting place of such a creature is as haunting as it is plausible, given the region's rich history of superstition. Another theory that has persisted is that the grave belongs to someone who died of a plague, a devastating and mysterious disease that ravaged Europe during this period. Transylvania was not exempt from the periodic outbreaks of disease, and the small villages of the Carpathian Mountains often became isolated breeding grounds for epidemics. In times of plague, fear ruled the land, and those afflicted were often abandoned, buried in unmarked graves without ceremony, lest the disease spread further. The villagers of Dharmanesti could have buried a plague victim in the village center to keep the contagion away from the rest of the community. Yet, this theory is complicated by the fact that the grave was kept so secret for so long. Why would the villagers, in their attempts to protect themselves, leave no sign at all of the deceased. Why would they choose to hide it in the heart of the settlement? If the grave was truly the final resting place of a plague victim, the secrecy surrounding it would imply that there was something more to the story, something that went beyond the simple tragedy of disease. The notion of a hidden or erased death, rather than a natural one, seems to capture the essence of Dharmanesti's mystery. While each theory presents its own intriguing possibility, they all share one common theme: the grave is not merely a physical resting place. It represents something far deeper, an unresolved story, a secret buried by time, and a tragedy that remains locked away from the world. The grave at the center of the village, unmarked and forgotten, becomes a symbol of what has been lost, and what the villagers have refused to confront. In a place like Dharmanesti, where the line between history and myth is blurred, the unanswered questions surrounding the grave are not just about the identity of the deceased. They are about the village itself, the stories it has chosen to bury, the fears it has chosen to suppress, and the mystery that continues to haunt it. What lies beneath the earth at Dharmanesti is a riddle that may never be solved. Each theory, whether rooted in politics, witchcraft, or disease, offers a different lens through which to view the past, but none of them provide a definitive answer. The unmarked grave, much like the village itself, remains a place where history and myth collide, and the secrets of the past refuse to be uncovered. In the heart of Dharmanesti, a silence lingers that feels almost unnatural. The village, once a bustling community, now lies in a state of eerie stillness, as if frozen in time. The streets, once filled with the sounds of daily life, the laughter of children, the chatter of neighbors, the rhythmic hum of work, are now devoid of noise. The only sound that breaks the silence is the occasional rustle of wind through the trees, or the distant murmur of the river that runs nearby. The houses, though they remain standing, have begun to crumble, their walls decaying under the weight of neglect and the passing years. Yet, amid all this decay, the unmarked grave at the village center continues to stand, as resolute and unmoving as the village itself. And the silence that surrounds it is not just a result of time's passing. It feels as though the village itself is holding its breath, waiting for something, perhaps a truth to be revealed, perhaps a curse to be lifted. The sense of quiet that envelops Dharmanesti is unsettling, particularly when one considers the vibrant community that once thrived here. In the years before the village's slow decline, it was a place of life and activity. Like many rural villages, it relied heavily on agriculture and animal husbandry, with families working together to cultivate the land and raise livestock. In the evening, the streets would have been filled with the sounds of people returning home, their voices carrying through the air as they shared the events of their day. Children would have run through the streets, their laughter echoing across the valley, while the elderly gathered on porches, exchanging stories, gossip, and wisdom. It was a place where life was both hard and rewarding, a place where everyone knew each other, and each day brought new work, new challenges, and new joys. But somewhere along the way, this vibrant energy began to fade. It didn't happen overnight, nor was it the result of a single event. Rather, it was a slow and gradual process, one that mirrored the broader shifts taking place in Romania during this period. The village, isolated from the larger political and social movements of the time, began to lose its vitality as younger generations moved away in search of better opportunities. The once thriving community was gradually abandoned, its residents scattered across the country, leaving behind empty houses and fading memories. The grave, however, remained at the center, untouched by the passage of time, as if it were the one constant in a world that had begun to shift and change around it. The reasons for the village's decline are complex, but they are rooted in both external and internal factors. On the one hand, the changing political landscape of Romania during the 18th and 19th centuries had a significant impact on rural villages like Dharmanesti. The Habsburg Empire, which had extended its influence over Transylvania, brought with it new laws and taxes that were often burdensome for the local population. The once autonomous villages found themselves under the control of foreign rulers, whose priorities were not always in line with the needs of the rural communities. The resulting sense of alienation and oppression led many young people to leave the village in search of work or better prospects elsewhere. This exodus from rural areas was not unique to Dharmanesti, but was part of a broader trend that saw many villages slowly entered as people moved to the cities, leaving behind only the elderly and those unable to travel. At the same time, the villages of Dharmanesti were also bound by their own superstitions and beliefs, which kept them tethered to the land but also contributed to their sense of isolation. The unmarked grave, with its dark mystery, played a role in this. It was not just a burial site, it was a symbol of the village's history, a history that few dared to confront. The grave was a silent reminder of the past, a past filled with unanswered questions and unresolved tensions. For many of the villagers, this past was not something they could easily let go of. It was a legacy that they lived with every day, a presence that cast a shadow over their lives. And so, while the village slowly entered, the grave remained at the center, an unspoken truth that refused to be buried along with the town's former inhabitants. The silence that now pervades Dharmanesti is not merely a physical absence of sound. It is a silence steeped in mystery, in the weight of history, and in the fear of what the grave represents. The village is haunted by its own past, and the grave is the key to understanding what lies beneath the surface. It is a place that the villagers dared not speak of, for to do so would be to disturb something that had been carefully concealed for generations. The silence, then, is not one of peace or tranquility, but of tension, a tension that grips the village and its people, even as they try to move on. But the silence of Dharmanesti is not limited to the absence of sound. It is also a silence in the collective memory of the village. As the years passed, the stories and legends that had once surrounded the grave began to fade, and with them, the knowledge of the events that had led to its creation. The older generations, who held the keys to the village's past, passed away, leaving behind only fragments of memories, many of which were deliberately suppressed or forgotten. The younger generations, who had left in search of a different life, had little reason to return or to remember. For them, Dharmanesti had become a place that existed only in their memories, a place they had outgrown. The grave, like the village itself, became something to be forgotten. Yet, the very act of forgetting is a powerful thing. The silence that envelops Dharmanesti is not a passive one. It is a force that has shaped the town's history. It is a silence that has been deliberately cultivated, one that has kept the town's darkest secrets buried beneath layers of time and neglect. In this silence, the grave remains not just a physical marker of death, but a symbol of the town's refusal to confront its past. The villagers have built their lives around the grave, but they have never truly examined what it means. They have allowed the grave to become an unspoken truth, a truth that no one dares to acknowledge. And in doing so, they have allowed the mystery of the grave to remain unsolved, perpetuating the silence that has defined the village for centuries. As the years go by, the village continues to decay, its inhabitants few and far between. The streets grow quieter, the houses more dilapidated, and the presence of the grave seems all the more pronounced. It is as though the grave, and the silence that surrounds it, is drawing the life out of Dharmanesti, leaving behind only the remnants of what once was. Yet, even in its decay, the grave remains a potent symbol, one that speaks to the larger themes of time, memory, and the weight of history. The silence that defines Dharmanesti is not merely the absence of sound. It is the absence of understanding, of closure, of resolution. In this silence, the grave stands as a reminder of what has been lost. It is a place that, despite its decay, continues to exert its influence over the village and its people. It is a place where the past has been buried, but never forgotten. And as long as the grave remains unmarked and its story remains untold, the silence of Dharmanesti will continue to haunt the village, a ghostly presence that lingers in the corners of the town's memory. The silence is not just a feature of the village, it is the village itself, a living, breathing entity shaped by the shadows of its past. And until the mystery of the grave is unraveled, Dharmanesti will remain a place where silence speaks louder than words. The enigma of Dharmanesti is inextricably tied to its isolation. Nestled deep within the Carpathian Mountains, far from the bustling cities and political centers of Romania, the village was once a microcosm of rural life, separated from the grand historical currents that swept through the rest of the country. Over time, this geographical and cultural isolation has transformed Dharmanesti into a place where the past is preserved in ways that the outside world might never fully comprehend. It is not just the physical isolation of the village, however, that has kept it shrouded in mystery, but the sense of spiritual seclusion, a kind of barrier erected by the villagers themselves to protect their ways of life and the secrets they carry. In the absence of the outside world, Dharmanesti became a village where oral tradition and superstition played an outsized role. For centuries, the villagers had relied on these traditions to guide them through the trials of daily life. This was a community rooted in folklore, in stories passed down through generations. Every corner of the village, every tree in the surrounding woods, every stream and ridge, was imbued with meaning, with a history steeped in belief. It was a world where the supernatural had as much a place as the natural, where omens, spirits, and curses were just as real as the fields they worked or the animals they raised. But it was the grave at the heart of Dharmanesti that served as the focal point for many of these beliefs, casting a shadow over everything the villagers did. Theories about the grave's origin and the identity of its occupant were passed down through the generations, each new theory contributing to the growing legend of Dharmanesti. It wasn't just the grave itself that fascinated the villagers, it was the stories that surrounded it, the whispers that traveled like smoke from mouth to mouth, carried by a sense of fear and wonder. People spoke of the grave in hushed tones, as though even mentioning it aloud might summon something dark from the past. It was as though the grave held a power, not just over the land but over the people themselves. Some believed that the grave was a source of protection, a talisman placed at the center of the village to ward off evil or misfortune. Others feared it was a curse, a place that had drawn dark forces into their midst and trapped them there, leaving a permanent scar on the land. Whatever the truth, it was clear that the grave had become more than just a final resting place. It was a spiritual center, a nexus of energy that seemed to bind the people of Dharmanesti to something far older and more mysterious than they could comprehend. Despite the villagers' increasing isolation from the outside world, its ties to its past remained strong. The grave became a kind of anchor, keeping the community tethered to a history that no one dared fully examine. In many ways, it was a symbol of the villagers' collective trauma. The fear that surrounded the grave was not just about what lay beneath the earth, but about the knowledge that the past held secrets that were better left buried. Perhaps, in a way, the grave was a reflection of the villagers' collective psyche, a place where repressed memories and unspoken fears found their home. Over time, as fewer people remained in the village to remember the stories and legends, the grave became an object of legend itself, its origins lost to time, its meaning obscured by layers of superstition. But for those who lived in the village long enough, the silence surrounding the grave took on an oppressive quality. It was not just the physical silence of an abandoned place, but the heavy, suffocating silence of secrets too dangerous to speak. The people of Dharmanesti, though resilient, had always known that they lived in the shadow of something darker, something that could never be fully explained. There were those who insisted that the grave marked the resting place of a figure so important, so powerful, that even speaking of it could invoke tragedy. Whether it was a nobleman whose death had political implications or someone associated with witchcraft, there was a pervasive sense that the grave was a place of power, and that power had a cost. No one dared disturb it, for fear that in doing so, they might awaken something that could not be controlled. Yet, the weight of this mystery began to take its toll on the villagers. As time went on, the younger generations began to question the silence. They were raised on stories of the grave, fed a steady diet of fear and curiosity, but they had never seen the darkness for themselves. The village, isolated in the mountains, had become a place that people left behind in search of better opportunities, a place whose significance seemed to wane as the outside world crept closer. And yet, the grave remained. As new generations left Dharmanesti and went to cities like Bucharest or Cluj, they carried with them the stories of the village and its mysterious heart, but they left the grave behind, unsure of its place in their lives. But even as the village emptied out, the grave stood firm. It was as if the past refused to release its hold on Dharmanesti. The few villagers who remained felt the weight of this legacy in ways they could not always explain. The grave was not just a relic of a forgotten time, it was a presence that lingered in their daily lives, a constant reminder that something was left unresolved, that the mystery had not yet been solved. For those few souls still living in the village, the grave became an inescapable fact of life, something that could not be ignored but was also too dangerous to confront. Their relationship with it was one of unspoken understanding, an agreement to live around the grave but never to disturb it. It is this tension, the clash between the villagers' need to preserve the past and their desire to move forward, that lies at the heart of Dharmanesti's mystery. The village, frozen in time, reflects the struggles of a people who have been caught between two worlds. One world is the world of the past, where traditions and superstitions ruled, and where the grave held a central place in the community's collective psyche. The other world is the world of progress, of cities, technology, and the increasing influence of the modern age. Dharmanesti, in its isolation, has resisted this change. Its inhabitants have held tight to their memories and their customs, but at what cost? The very thing that has preserved the village, the grave, the silence, the fear, has also kept it from moving forward. In its reluctance to face the truth of the past, the village remains trapped, suspended in a state of perpetual unease, haunted by a mystery it cannot solve. And so, Dharmanesti exists in a state of limbo, a place where the present is inextricably linked to the past. The grave at the center of the village is both a source of strength and a source of fear. It is the anchor that has held the village in place, but it is also the thing that has kept it from growing. Those who remain in Dharmanesti are bound to it, just as the village itself is bound to its secrets. The grave, though physically unremarkable, is a place where time stands still, where the past refuses to be forgotten, and where the weight of history bears down on the present with a force that cannot be ignored. Until the mystery of the grave is uncovered, Dharmanesti will remain a place suspended in time, a place where the shadows of the past continue to shape the future. As the years turned into decades, and the centuries continued to pass, the mystery of Dharmanesti's unmarked grave remained one of the most haunting aspects of the village's identity. Despite the slow decay of the settlement and the steady erosion of its ties to the outside world, the legend of the grave never fully dissipated. In fact, it only deepened with time, becoming more enigmatic and unsettling as each new generation added their own interpretations to its origins. The once thriving community that had surrounded the grave became a ghost of its former self, with only a handful of people still living among the ruins, reluctant to leave a place so bound to their own history. The few remaining inhabitants of Dharmanesti, now growing older and more reclusive, have become the keepers of the village's dark secrets. They are the last living link to the stories and traditions that have surrounded the grave for centuries. Yet even among these last villagers, there is a palpable sense of unease when the subject of the grave is broached. Some are reluctant to speak of it, others claim to know little about its origins, and a few even assert that there are certain things best left undisturbed. The silence surrounding the grave has become so deeply ingrained in the culture of Dharmanesti that even in the face of growing curiosity from outsiders, the villagers maintain a veil of secrecy. For them, the grave is not just a relic of the past, it is a living presence, a force that governs the rhythm of their daily lives in ways they cannot fully explain. This hesitation to engage with the mystery is not merely a reflection of the villagers' reluctance to discuss the past, it is an expression of something deeper. The grave has become a symbol of unresolved trauma, a site where the community's darkest fears are buried, and yet remain ever present. There is an unspoken understanding among the villagers that to confront the grave, to try and uncover its secrets, is to disturb a peace that has been painstakingly maintained for generations. The past, as they see it, has a power of its own, one that cannot be easily unraveled without consequence. In a world where reality and superstition are often indistinguishable, to disturb the grave is to risk unleashing something that has been held in check for far too long. For many who have ventured into Dharmanesti with the hope of solving its mystery, the village has been a place of disillusionment. There are no easy answers, no clear-cut explanations to be found. The remnants of the village are as much a puzzle as the grave itself. Its abandoned houses are filled with broken furniture and shattered windows, each corner holding the residue of a life that once was but is no longer. The fields that once fed the village have grown wild, the crops untended, the pathways overrun with thorns and weeds. The air itself seems heavy with the weight of history, as though it is steeped in the fears and uncertainties of those who once called this place home. And yet, even in the face of such desolation, there is a sense of reverence for the land. The grave, despite its unsettling nature, still holds a kind of sacred power over the village. For the villagers, it has become a part of the landscape, like the mountains that surround them, a feature of their world that is so deeply entwined with their lives that to remove it would be to disrupt the delicate balance that has kept them, for better or for worse, connected to the past. The grave is no longer just the final resting place of some unknown individual. It is a marker of the village's identity, a touchstone for everything the people of Dharmanesti have experienced and endured over the centuries. It is a physical manifestation of their collective history, a history that remains locked in a cryptic silence. The question, then, is not whether the grave will ever be understood, but whether it needs to be. To some, the grave is a mystery that should remain unsolved, a puzzle whose pieces do not belong together. There is a comfort in the unknown, a kind of quiet peace in letting the mystery persist without the need for resolution. In this sense, the grave has taken on a life of its own, becoming a symbol of the village's quiet endurance. As the world outside Dharmanesti continues to change, as modernity encroaches ever further into the rural countryside, the grave remains steadfast, an eternal reminder of the forces that once shaped this place. For those who continue to call Dharmanesti home, the grave is more than just a curiosity. It is a part of the landscape that cannot be easily overlooked. It is the village's final connection to a time long past, a time when life was simpler, but perhaps also more fraught with mystery and danger. The grave serves as a repository for the secrets of the village, holding within its soil the hidden truths that have shaped the course of its history. Yet, as much as the villagers fear what might be revealed by uncovering the grave's origins, they are also drawn to it, as if they are both repelled and captivated by the magnetic pull of its unanswered questions. The grave is a force that continues to shape the village, even as the people who once lived around it disappear into the past. The silence that surrounds the grave is a silence that speaks volumes. It is a silence that has become a kind of language in itself, one that is understood by those who have lived in the shadow of the grave for so long. It is a language of respect, of fear, and of mourning for something that cannot be fully understood but must still be acknowledged. In the end, the unmarked grave is more than just a physical location. It is a marker of the village's endurance, a testament to the mysteries that remain hidden beneath the surface of history, and a reminder of the power that silence can hold. Whether the truth of the grave will ever be revealed is uncertain, but its presence will continue to haunt Dharmanesti as long as the village stands, a ghostly witness to a past that refuses to be forgotten. The allure of Dharmanesti lies not just in its physical remnants, but in the deep-seated mystery that still surrounds its abandoned streets and crumbling homes. The village, a once thriving settlement nestled within the Carpathian Mountains, now stands as a haunting reminder of a forgotten past. It is not simply the decay of buildings or the slow encroachment of nature upon the land that captivates the few who visit. It is the palpable sense of an unresolved history, one that is inseparable from the grave that lies at its center. This unmarked grave, the heart of the village, has stood for centuries as a silent witness to the passage of time, a mystery that has remained stubbornly out of reach. In many ways, Dharmanesti reflects the larger struggle of rural communities throughout Romania and Eastern Europe, where the march of progress has left behind those who clung to their ancient ways. The modern world has moved on, but for places like Dharmanesti, the past remains an ever-present force, shaping the lives of those who still linger there. For the few villagers who remain, the grave is both a source of fear and reverence, an object that represents not just death, but the unresolved tensions between the village's past and its uncertain future. For generations, the villagers have lived in the shadow of the grave, and their lives have been shaped by its mystery. It is more than just a burial site. It has become a part of the very fabric of their existence. In a place where the natural and supernatural are intertwined, where legends and folklore hold sway, the grave has taken on an almost sacred significance. It is a link to the past, a past that is veiled in secrecy, filled with stories of witches, curses, and dark powers that the villagers both feared and respected. There are those who speak of the grave as though it were a living thing, its presence in the center of the village both a protector and a harbinger of doom. Some of the oldest stories about the grave suggest that it was not always a place of reverence. In the early days of the village's founding, it is believed that the grave was a marker for someone who had died under mysterious or violent circumstances. There were rumors that the person buried there had been a figure of great importance, someone whose death had been so significant that it required secrecy. Perhaps they were a leader, a noble, or someone who had been involved in political or religious conflicts. The theories about the grave's occupant are varied, but they all share one common theme. The death was something that could not be openly acknowledged, and the grave was a way of hiding the truth. As time went on, the story surrounding the grave grew more fantastical. It was said to be the resting place of a powerful witch, someone who had practiced dark magic and whose death had been marked by a violent and mysterious end. Some believed that the person buried there had been a victim of a curse that had plagued the village for generations. The supernatural became inextricably linked to the grave, and the people of Dharmanesti began to view it not as a mere burial site, but as a place of power, an object of both fascination and fear. But as the village slowly emptied, as younger generations moved to the cities in search of better opportunities, the importance of the grave became increasingly isolated to the few remaining villagers. In their seclusion, the myth grew stronger. Those who stayed behind were not only tied to the grave by geography but by the stories and beliefs that had been passed down through the generations. The silence surrounding the grave deepened as the community shrank, and with fewer people around to share the oral traditions, the legends grew more elusive. The once vibrant conversations about the grave became whispers, and the whispers became little more than rumors. Still, the grave remained a powerful force in the lives of those who lived in Dharmanesti. For the last inhabitants, it was a constant, almost inescapable presence. Some of them claimed that strange occurrences had been linked to the grave, particularly at night. There were whispers of figures seen near the site, of unnatural sounds echoing through the streets in the dead of night. Some claimed to have heard voices carried by the wind. Others believed they had seen shadows flickering near the grave, only to disappear as soon as they looked away. Whether these stories were born from the fear and isolation of a small village, or whether something truly supernatural lingered in the grave's proximity, no one could say. But the stories persisted, and they only fueled the sense of mystery and dread that surrounded the site. The grave, despite its eerie influence, was also a place of protection, according to some villagers. There was a belief that as long as the grave remained undisturbed, as long as the mystery surrounding it remained intact, the village would be safe from harm. It was as though the grave served as a barrier, keeping the forces of evil at bay. In the absence of modern conveniences and technology, the grave became a symbolic protector, a way to hold on to the old ways and keep the world outside at arm's length. It was a reminder of a time when the village lived in harmony with the land and with its own customs, before the encroachment of modern life, before the silence became all-consuming. However, as more people left and the village continued its slow decline, this belief in the grave's power waned. The world outside was changing, and with it, the villagers' relationship to their own history. The younger generation, unfamiliar with the ancient superstitions and customs that had shaped the village, had little interest in the mystery of the grave. They had grown up in a world where technology and science had replaced the need for folklore and superstition. As Dharmanesti grew emptier, the grave's significance seemed to fade, and it was left to the few remaining villagers to hold on to its importance. But despite the waning interest in the grave, there remained a sense of something unspoken in the village. The few who still lived in Dharmanesti could not deny the power of the grave, nor could they ignore the weight of the past that seemed to cling to the very ground beneath their feet. The villagers who remained continued to live around the grave, avoiding it in their daily lives but never truly able to escape it. It was a place that could not be ignored, for its presence was not just physical, it was deeply embedded in the collective memory of the community. The grave had become more than just a burial site. It had become a symbol, a representation of everything that Dharmanesti had been and everything it could never be again. The passing of time had only made the village and its grave more enigmatic. The world had moved on, but Dharmanesti had remained frozen in its own history, bound by the secrets that had never been revealed. As the last few villagers lived out their days in the village, they did so under the shadow of the grave, a grave whose mystery could never be unraveled, a grave whose silence could never be fully understood. And in that silence, the village itself remained suspended between the past and the present, a place where time no longer mattered, and where the grave was the only constant, the only thing that had truly withstood the ravages of history. As the years continue to unfold, the story of Dharmanesti, and specifically its haunting unmarked grave, remains one that challenges both logic and belief. Though many outsiders have come and gone, curious about the secrets the village hides, the legacy of the grave is still firmly rooted in the soil of Dharmanesti. The villagers who remain are few, their lives quiet and almost reverent, shaped by the weight of an ancient mystery that is both deeply ingrained in their culture and yet largely unspoken. The tale of the grave is not just a local legend, it is an integral part of the village's very identity. For the people who still linger in the fading settlement, it represents a bridge to a past that is as mysterious as it is chilling. Over the years, attempts have been made to solve the riddle of the grave. Historians, archaeologists, and even paranormal investigators have journeyed to Dharmanesti, each hoping to uncover some shred of evidence that might explain the inexplicable. But despite the best efforts of these seekers of truth, the grave remains as elusive as ever. Some have tried to trace the history of the land, scouring old records and documents that might shed light on the grave's origin, yet these attempts have often proven fruitless. The village's own oral histories are rich with tales, but they are vague, their details slippery, as though the very act of speaking about the grave risks awakening something that should be left alone. The absence of written records is part of what makes the mystery so impenetrable. The village of Dharmanesti has always been a place where the past is not easily understood through conventional means. The people of the village have relied on their stories, their myths, and their traditions to navigate the world, and in this world, logic does not always hold sway. There is an understanding among the villagers that some things cannot be explained, they can only be experienced. And in Dharmanesti, the experience of the grave is something that transcends the limitations of the tangible world. It is a presence that does not need to be understood, only respected. The reluctance to speak about the grave, and the sense of unease that permeates the village, are not simply born of superstition, they reflect a deep, collective trauma. There is a sense among the villagers that the grave represents something that they are not ready to confront. It is as though the grave serves as a physical manifestation of the fear that binds the community, a fear of uncovering truths that might prove too terrifying to face. This fear is not just about what is buried beneath the earth, it is about what the grave represents, secrets that, if revealed, could unravel the fabric of the village itself. For many of the villagers, the idea that the grave is more than just a resting place for a long-dead figure is something that must be preserved. They fear that disturbing the grave's silence will open a door that should remain closed. Some have speculated that the grave holds the remains of a prominent figure, someone whose death had political or spiritual significance. Others suggest that the grave could be the site of a ritualistic burial, perhaps tied to witchcraft or some other forbidden practice. These theories, though varied, all carry an element of the supernatural, a sense that the grave is not just a historical curiosity but a place of power, one that holds sway over the land and its people. The mystery of the grave is tied to the broader sense of unease that surrounds Dharmanesti, a village that, despite its physical isolation, is inextricably linked to the darker side of human history. The concept of burial, and the rituals surrounding it, has always been deeply significant in Eastern Europe. In many cultures, the act of burying the dead is not just a way of disposing of the body but a way of ensuring that the spirit of the deceased finds peace. But in a place like Dharmanesti, where so many of the customs are rooted in ancient beliefs, burial can also be seen as a way of keeping the dead from coming back. The fear that the grave might hold the remains of someone who could return, whether in the form of a restless spirit or a malevolent force, is a constant undercurrent in the village's collective consciousness. The presence of the grave, with its unmarked nature and its aura of mystery, only serves to heighten these fears. In the absence of concrete answers, the grave has become a place where folklore and reality blur together. Some of the more extreme stories told by the villagers describe strange occurrences in the village at night, phantom figures wandering the streets, eerie lights that seem to emanate from the grave itself, and whispers that carry on the wind. The stories are often dismissed by outsiders as mere superstition, but to those who live in Dharmanesti, they are very real. These supernatural accounts, whether true or not, continue to shape the village's relationship with the grave. The fear of what might lie beneath the soil is as powerful as the fear of the unknown. Even as the village continues to fade, as the last generation of villagers grows older and fewer people visit, the grave remains a constant. The village may no longer be the thriving community it once was, but the grave continues to haunt its residents. Those who have left the village carry the stories with them, but they rarely return, for Dharmanesti holds a power that is difficult to escape. The memories of the grave, the fear of what it represents, are not easily shaken off.